Come on, we gather in. Thanks. Well, thank you everyone for being here today for this historic marker dedication, a chance to recognize an unsung hero of the Alton community, except for academics and legal scholars and the most knowledgeable of you about local history, Scott Bibb. Scott must be smiling down on us today because he did a good job with the weather. So we're excited to have a great day and have such a great crowd. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to recognize some important people in our audience today. We have Senator Andy Manar. Hold your hand up, Senator Andy Manar here. Brenda Walker McCain, Vice President of the Lewis and Clark Board of Trustees. There's Brenda. Pete Basola, Assistant Secretary. Marlene Barch, Secretary. And George Terry, Board Member. Where's George? There he is, over there. From the Foundation Board, Ajay Patek, who's a CEO and President of the Order of St. Francis, one of our neighbors here, but also on our Foundation Board, Ajay. And Sharon Roberts from the Foundation Board. Saw Sharon here, there she is, over there. Representing the City of Alton, Mayor Brant Walker. Representing the Village of Godfrey, Mayor Mike McCormick. Alton Township Supervisor Don Huber. Representing the Illinois Appellate Court, Judge Judy Cates. Representing the Illinois Supreme Court, Justice Rita Garman. And Justice Ann Burke. Representing the Illinois Supreme Court Historic Preservation Commission, John Lupton. Scott Zella, and Judge Neil Conan of the Circuit Court of Cook County. Representing the Illinois State Historic Society, Stu Freely. There he is. There. And Dr. Shirley Portwood, Historian Emeritus, SIUE Edwardsville, and she'll be on the program. See Charlotte Johnson. Is Charlotte Johnson here? Okay, Charlotte over there. Chris Norman, Vice President for Finance of the Alton School District, RSVP. Bishop Samuel White. Bishop White, there he is. Judge Dwayne Bailey, Associate Judge, Madison County. Is Dwayne here? Okay, there he is. Okay. Judge Eller Duff, also of Madison County. Back there, okay. Okay. Scott Bibb is not a common or often acknowledged name in this community, but we're hoping to change the Supreme Court, who is hoping that Lewis and Clark might be interested in helping the Supreme Court's Historic Preservation Commission with the History on Trial series. So Supreme Court Justice Rita Garman will share more of the incredible details about this series and the significance to the Illinois Supreme Court and the people of Illinois in a few minutes. Although many of us were not aware of Scott Bibb's legacy before the Illinois State Supreme Court approached us about sharing this case throughout the state, one local resident was very familiar. In fact, she was a leading historian to conduct research on Scott Bibb's fight to ensure that his children and all black children were allowed to return to their neighborhood schools. Dr. Shirley Portwood is a Godfrey resident, achieved Professor Emeritus status at SIUE, where she taught in the Department of History for 30 years. She continues to serve on the SIU board, appointed to the overall Board of Trustees. Dr. Portwood's extensive body of research and publication is focused on Illinois African American history, includes published work, school segregation in Southern Illinois, the Alton School Cases 1897 and 1908, published in 2005. Please welcome Dr. Shirley Portwood.
Thank you. This afternoon, we gather to honor Scott Bibb for his struggle to bring free public education in desegregated schools to all children in Alton, Illinois. Bibb, with overwhelming support from the African American community, devoted 11 years from 1897 to 1908 to a battle called by his contemporaries the Alton School Fight or the Alton School Case. The most dramatic part of the Alton School Fight was a lawsuit called the People of the State of Illinois ex rel. Scott Bibb versus the Mayor and Common Council of the City of Alton. In many respects, Bibbs is a representative figure whose efforts to attain desegregated schools mirror those of thousands of African Americans throughout Illinois and the United States. A series of lawsuits collectively called the Illinois school cases included Bloomington, Quincy, Upper Alton, Centralia, DuQuoin, and elsewhere, and they spanned the years from 1874 into the early 20th century. Thus, in honoring Scott Bibb, we honor those who stood with him in Alton, the state of Illinois, and the nation. Scott Bibb was born a slave in Missouri in 1855. He and his family migrated to Alton in 1863 during the Civil War. He began his education at a segregated black school, but in 1872, he and other black children entered the newly desegregated schools. Harry Coates, a classmate of Bibb's and a fellow leader of the Alton School Fight, indicated that blacks had fought to desegregate the schools at that time too. The Illinois Constitution of 1870, the Illinois School Law of 1872, as well as federal civil rights legislation had paved the way for desegregation. Scott Bibb was an excellent student who not only completed grade school, but he also graduated from Alton High School. This would have been in the 1870s. His high school diploma rendered Bibb an exceptionally well-educated person, inasmuch as very few people in the 19th century attended high school. Indeed, many had only a grammar school education or less. After high school, Bibb was qualified to teach school, but Alton, like most desegregated school systems, did not hire African American teachers. Bibb became a fireman at the Illinois Glass Works, a relatively well-paid and prestigious semi-skilled position. Bibb married and had 4 children, the eldest of whom were Ambrose and Minnie, in whose behalf he brought the lawsuit. For nearly 25 years, African American and white children had attended the same 5 schools in Alton, but on the morning of September 20th, 1897, 8-year-old Ambrose Bibb and 7-year-old Minnie Bibb went to the Washington school which they had previously attended. They, along with all black children, were denied entry to the 5 previously existing schools. All black children were reassigned to the newly constructed Lovejoy School and Douglas School. White children continued to attend the 5 pre-existing schools. Scott Bibb and the black community immediately challenged the segregated schools in 4 ways. They confronted city and school officials. The children sat in at the 5 white schools. The children boycotted the 2 black schools, and Bibb filed the aforementioned lawsuit. Filed in 1897, the suit ended 11 years later in 1908 with an Illinois Supreme Court verdict in favor of Bibb. Several factors prompted city and school officials to segregate the schools. The United States Supreme Court had ruled in 1896 in the Plessy versus Ferguson case that separate but equal was an acceptable public policy. Further, the late 19th century saw the abandonment of Reconstruction by the Republican Party. The Democrats had never championed Reconstruction in the first place. Various school and city officials in Alton wanted to see the expansion of the city geographically by annexing various contiguous towns like North Alton and Upper Alton. Most of the residents of these towns were white, and the presumption was they would be more comfortable becoming a part of Alton if Alton had segregated schools as those municipalities did. Many Alton officials thought that the potential migrants from Missouri and elsewhere might find Alton more appealing if the schools were segregated as well. And finally, the personal racial animus of various city and school officials informed the decision to segregate the schools. Despite segregating the 7 public schools, all city and school officials maintained that the schools were not segregated during this entire 11 years, and all of these cases coming before the Supreme Court and before the Madison County Circuit Court. The official response from Alton was that the schools were not segregated racially, that they displayed no racial bias. The evidence to the contrary was absolutely overwhelming, however. The Bibb lawsuit, as well as other activities that resisted separate schools, engaged virtually the entire African American community of Alton. In order to challenge the segregation, the Black community formed 2 committees: the Citizens Committee, composed entirely of men, and the Women's Committee. The men's group were the political activists who met with the attorneys, traveled to various places seeking support for the lawsuit, and raised money. The women's group planned and executed various social activities in order to maintain community support for the desegregation efforts. And the women also were fundraisers for the cause. Throughout the 11-year battle, the leaders pursued a brilliant strategy. They intertwined the political with the social events. Wednesday and Saturday evenings were devoted to the school case. The political part of the meeting was held first, and after that, the social events took place. The social events might include a dinner or a picnic, an excursion on a riverboat, complete with games and meals, or perhaps a dance where prizes were given to the best dancers. The social activities both raised money and maintained community enthusiasm for the cause. Further, all entertainments were open to visitors from beyond the Alton area. Thus, people came from East St. Louis, Springfield, Peoria, Chicago, and other Illinois locales. They came from St. Louis and elsewhere in Missouri. Some visitors came from more distant locations. Often these visitors took information about the Alton school case back to their own communities, which sometimes provided financial assistance and other support. The lawsuit began in Madison County Circuit Court after 7 jury trials, 2 of which resulted in a hung jury and 5 rendered a verdict for the defense. 5 times the case went on appeal to the Illinois Supreme Court, which each time remanded the case back to the Circuit Court for a ruling consistent with the evidence. After the 5th appeal to the Illinois Supreme Court, that body, despairing of a fair verdict from the Madison County Circuit Court, ruled in favor of Scott Bibb and ordered the desegregation of the Alton schools. Scott Bibb and the Black community anticipated that the matter was closed and that their children would attend schools alongside white children. This apparent victory for the Black community did not result in the full desegregation of the Alton schools, however. School and city officials maintained that the Illinois Supreme Court verdict applied only to Minnie and Ambrose Bibb. Even their younger siblings were refused admission to the white schools. Further, the school authorities determined that Minnie, who was 18, would have to return to school at the 3rd grade level, and Ambrose, who was 19, would have to enter school at the 5th grade level. Minnie attended 3rd grade for 2 weeks, during which she was ignored by the teachers and ridiculed by the students. Ambrose, who had found employment in Iowa, did not return to the Alton schools. What should have been a resounding victory for Scott Bibb, his children, and the entire Black community was instead turned into another painful chapter in the struggle for African American rights. And yet we remember Scott Bibb and the other local heroes today. In going through this building, I can only imagine what Scott Bibb and others who were involved in that Alton school case would say about this wonderful building and the kinds of programs that are a part of it. Today, then, we Honor Scott Bibb and the myriad Scott Bibbs who fought courageously for the rights guaranteed to them and their children by the U.S. Constitution and various state and federal statutes. And today we see before us both a permanent marker and an educational institution acknowledging Scott Bibb and attesting to his importance as a historical figure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Portwood, for your words and for your extensive research that helps us understand the significance of the naming of this building behind us and this marker today. In addition to Dr. Portwood's research and determination in establishing this historic marker, and raising our awareness in the community of Scott Bibb, Dr. Linda Chapman was also determined to install a marker. She's from Boston. She probably called it a maca, but it was a marker. Dr. Chapman is a Vice President for Academic Affairs at the college and worked with Dr. Portwood not only on the application to Illinois State Historic Society to bring to Alton the very first historic marker to acknowledge the work of an African American in Alton, but also worked to assist in the Illinois State Supreme Court Historic Preservation Commission in the months leading up to the April 2015 presentation, History on Trial, Alton School Cases, which led to the naming of the Scott Bibb Center. Please welcome Dr. Linda Chapman.
On February 10, 2015, the Lewis and Clark Community College Board of Trustees renamed the former St. Patrick's School the Scott Bibb Center. At the time, the college and the community were deeply immersed in the Illinois Supreme Court Historical Preservation Commission's History on Trial. We were reading and talking about Dr. Portwood's research on the Alton school case, as well as materials that were collated by the Historic Commission, and our research librarians at Lewis and Clark, who I know are here today. Thank you all. Several of us here today took part in one or more of the 3 panel discussions held in Godfrey, Springfield, and Chicago during April and May of 2015. The Alton school case initiated discussions among historians, lawyers, Illinois Supreme Court justices, educators, and community activists. Although many were aware of this 11-year slice of history, many more of us were not. Dr. Portwood has described Scott Bibb as the plaintiff in the Alton school case, a series of lawsuits, 1897 to 1908, seeking to retain integrated public schools, which had existed in Alton the previous 25 years. We can interpret his actions as those of a community activist and a community leader who in fall 1897, when the Alton School Board and City Council segregated black students to 2 new schools, encouraged the black community to resist. Blacks boycotted the black schools, conducted sit-ins in the white schools, and filed a lawsuit in Madison County Circuit Court. We measure Scott Bibb's determination by the number of court cases over 11 years. The case went to trial 7 times and to the Illinois Supreme Court on appeal 5 times. In the 5th appeal in 1908, as you heard, the Illinois Supreme Court ruled in favor of Bibb. However, just as black parents may have been thinking this would result in all children attending public schools without regard to race, the Alton mayor and city council contended that only Minnie and Ambrose Bibb could return to the same elementary school they had left 11 years earlier. Scott Bibb died the very next year. We don't know the level of disappointment Scott Bibb may have felt with this outcome, We don't know how he made sense of that 11-year struggle in his last year of life. I can say that as an educator and as a parent, I bring a perspective written about by John Dewey, American educational reformer. John Dewey was 50 when Scott Bibb died in 1909 at the age of 54. Dewey wrote, "What the wisest and best parents want for their children, we should all want for our children." Well, Scott Bibb was one of those wisest and best parents who spent 11 years of his life fighting for all children to be allowed to attend any school without regard to race. Today, Scott Bibb's historic marker shares this neighborhood with the beautiful Reverend Elijah P. Lovejoy Monument. That monument was dedicated in 1897, 60 years after Lovejoy was murdered by a mob for his anti-slavery writings. Ironically, at the time of the 1897 monument dedication, the city of Alton had just constructed 2 new schools for black children. These 2 black schools were named for the anti-slavery white minister, Reverend Lovejoy, and the anti-slavery African-American abolitionist, Frederick Douglass. Naming this building the Scott Bibb Center was the first step in memorializing the history and the heroism of Scott Bibb and the black community, who from 1897 to 1908 tried to correct an injustice by gaining public access to public schools for their children. This historical marker is the culmination of our efforts to honor Scott Bibb's leadership and the efforts and sacrifices made by the Alton African American community. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chapman. Lewis and Clark is extremely honored to have been working with the Illinois Supreme Court Historic Preservation Commission on the 4th installation of the History on Trial series, the Alton School Cases. We are honored today to welcome many members of the Illinois Supreme Court and the Illinois Supreme Court Historic Preservation Commission. It's with great respect and distinction that we welcome our next speaker, Justice Rita Garman. Justice Garman represents the 4th Judicial District of the Supreme Court, was elected by her peers to serve a 3-year term as Chief Justice starting in October 2013. She has served the Illinois Supreme Court since her appointment in February 2001. On the Supreme Court, Justice Garman also established a special committee on child custody issues and still serves as its liaison. Please welcome Justice Garman.
Thank you, Dr. Chapman. Distinguished guests, it is an honor and a privilege to be here with you today. I am certainly delighted to be joined by my colleague, Justice Ann Burke, who you were introduced to earlier, as representatives of the Illinois Supreme Court. We thank Dr. Chapman for this invitation, and we are very pleased and honored to join with you in recognizing the contributions of Scott Bibb. Justice Burke and I have been liaison to the Illinois Supreme Court Historic Preservation Commission since it was created by our colleagues in the legislature earlier in the last decade. And as a part of that, we set about to find cases that were of historical significance to the development of jurisprudence in Illinois and to put history on trial. And with the help of our wonderful director, John Lupton, we've been able, in the cooperation of some wonderful people as have spoken here today, we've been able to do that in some retrials of important issues. And it is actually true that we found the Alton school cases when the court was under restoration back in 2013 through 2014. We had to move everything out of the Supreme Court building in Springfield so that the contractors could have unimpeded contact with the building. And when we did that, our clerk happened upon these cases and brought them to our attention as historically significant, and wow, golly gee, we were just thrilled to pieces to see that and to see what part the Illinois Supreme Court had played. Illinois has produced many famous citizens. It's been the site of many events deserving recognition by historical markers, but none more so than Alton's own Scott Bibb. We can all be proud that Illinois was leading the way in 1874 when our legislature enacted a law declaring an end to segregation in the Illinois public schools. Unfortunately, that action was not enough, because individual school districts defied the law. Some, like Alton, actually resegregated the schools that had been previously attended by both black and white children, including Bibb's 2 children, as have been spoken of today. When the powers that be in Alton decided to reimpose segregation, 2 new schools were built for the sole purpose of segregating black students. They were the Frederick Douglass School and the Elijah Lovejoy School. As you know, Douglass was an African-American social reformer, abolitionist, orator, writer, and statesman. He was still living when the new Alton Public School was given his name. There's a certain irony in the choice to name a segregated school for a man who said, quote, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will," unquote. He may even have been thinking of the value of a good education when he said, quote, "It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men," unquote. One wonders if he was aware of the honor being conferred on him, or whether he would have approved had he known of the circumstances. Naming a segregated black school for Elijah Lovejoy was equally inappropriate. He was, as the people of Alton know, a white minister, journalist, newspaper editor, and most importantly, an abolitionist. He was killed here in Alton in 1837 when a mob attacked his warehouse, intent on destroying his printing press and the abolitionist materials it contained. In the wake of the opening of these 2 schools and other efforts to reimpose segregation here, Alton's black community organized sit-ins and boycotts to protest school segregation. The mob action and the killing of Lovejoy in 1837 has been described by some historians as the first battle of the Civil War. Similarly, the sit-ins, boycotts, and other protests against school segregation that Scott Bibb and his supporters engaged in were a foreshadowing of the civil rights movement that would eventually emerge in the 20th century. One may be inclined to think that Scott Bibb failed in his efforts to integrate the public schools of Alton. After all, local officials defied court orders, and his 2 children were not allowed to attend Alton's white grade school until they were already young adults. Frankly, as in many parts of our country, Alton schools did not integrate until the 1950s. But the actions taken here by Scott Bibb and others contributed to the movement that eventually led the United States Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. Thus, it is most fitting that Alton is now the home of the Scott Bibb Center at the Lewis and Clark Community College and of this historic market. I can't help but note that while the Alton school cases came before the Supreme Court on 5 separate occasions, the parties to those cases could not have imagined that in 1990, an African-American justice, my colleague Charles E. Freeman, would sit on the court and eventually serve as its Chief Justice. They most certainly would not have imagined at that time that 3 members of our court would be women, or that the United States Supreme Court would see similar changes. Our court is linked to this community, as it is to every community in our state. The Illinois Supreme Court Historic Preservation Commission strives to preserve this rich history, constantly searching for cases that have been decided by Illinois courts that contribute to this change in progress. We are very pleased that the efforts of the Supreme Court Historic Preservation Commission have contributed to preserving the memory of Scott Bibb and bringing his heroic efforts to the attention of a new generation of Illinois citizens. President Harry Truman once said, quote, "Men make history and not the other way around. In periods where there is no leadership, society stands still. Progress occurs when courageous, skillful leaders seize the opportunity to change things for the better." In 1874, the mayor of Alton and the superintendent of schools were office holders, but they were not true leaders. They resisted change, and in doing so, they resisted progress. Scott Bibb may have never held public office, but he was the true leader. He made history, and this community and our state are the better for it. So thank you for including me and Justice Burke and my colleagues of the court in this important celebration. And thank you for creating a lasting symbol of Scott Bibb in the Alton school cases. This historic marker commemorates not only his efforts, but the history of Illinois courts as well. And for this, we are humble and grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justice Garman. And special thanks to the Illinois Supreme Court Historic Preservation Commission. Could all the commission members just stand at one time here around the Illinois, because we have several of them here. All the commission members, please stand. Judge Cohen, yeah. Fantastic. Well done. The college has received tremendous support from the city of Alton since day one on the mission to recognize Scott Bibb properly here in his hometown. Mayor Brant was very supportive of our application to bring the historic marker to Alton. In addition, he's been very supportive of this facility. Please welcome the Mayor of Alton, Mayor Brant Walker.
Thank you, Dr. Chapman. Good afternoon. I want to thank everyone for coming out to the unveiling of this well-deserved historical marker. As you probably know, Alton is filled with rich history. Today's event is a celebration of an unsung hero who might have unfairly been seen just as a mere footnote in our rich history. Scott Bibb was an Altonian and an employee of the Alton Glass Works. And standing here in 2017, it's hard to believe that a father would have to fight for what every parent wants, which is just the best possible education and future for his children. Despite the law which called for an end to segregation of all public schools in 1873, Lovejoy and Douglas schools were both constructed for African American students to attend, furthering a doctrine which became known as separate but equal. Unfortunately, the separate but equal doctrine persisted until the Supreme Court's landmark ruling in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education, that segregated schools are inherently unequal. It truly is an honor to stand here today before you all in recognition of an early trailblazer and advocate for equal educational rights for African American students in Alton. I firmly believe if it was because of Scott Bibb's challenge to the policy of racially separated schools and his persistent resistance to segregation, we would not be where we are today. I find it very fitting that the newly named Scott Bibb Center builds on his legacy by expanding access to higher education to Alton community and the surrounding residents. In conclusion, I'd really like to thank Drs. Dale and Linda Chapman and the Lewis and Clark Community College for their efforts in making this event happen. Without them, this would not have started. And again, Dr. Linda Chapman, Dr. Dale Chapman, again, thank you so much for pointing a great spotlight in Alton and its rich history, as you always do. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you, Mayor Walker. And before we close with our final speaker, I'd like to invite Dr. Linda Chapman and Dr. Shirley Portwood to come forward to officially unveil our historic marker. Next, I'd like to ask Stu Fliege, for the Vice President of the Illinois State Historical Society, to come forward and share with us the significance of this historic marker we've unveiled today. Stu.
Thank you, President Chapman. I am Stu Fliege with the Illinois State Historical Society. I am the chairman of the Markers Committee as well as being vice president, and I want to bring the greetings and congratulations from Bill Furry. He is the executive director. He's the top dog in the Illinois State Historical Society. However, he had a hernia operation a couple of weeks ago. He wanted to be here real bad, but his doctor told him to stay in the air conditioning, get in the lazy boy and read a book. I told him to take a couple shots of Seagram 7 and see if that would help. But anyhow, it is the Illinois State Historical Society that does put up a lot of these markers around the state. My wife Judy and I have been to almost all of them, taking pictures of them and figuring out where they're at and trying to find them. Sometimes they're hard to find. When they redid a lot of roads, they renamed the roads because the phone call 911, et cetera, et cetera. Some of them are hard to find. So we've been to a lot of them. But I want to say this is one of the nicest crowds we've been to in quite a while. About the markers themselves, we have other markers in the area. In fact, at the campus right below Edwardsville, there's a marker for the Gotham Trail that went across southern Illinois in the very, very early days. There's one of our markers, I say our markers, Illinois State Historical Society, at the bottom of the hill here for the first prison in Illinois, which eventually became a Confederate prison during the Civil War. It's right down here at the bottom of the hill. A couple points about these markers. Number one, people do read them. I know a lot of people, this really happened with my brothers. We were going down to Reelfoot Lake fishing for crappie. And hey, historical marker ahead. Well, stop and look. You can't catch crappie at a historical marker. And that's the attitude of a lot of people. They could care less or couldn't care less, however they did. But people do stop and read them. My wife and I have visited with people that have stopped along the road that have read them. I've gotten phone calls from students who were looking for a topic to write on. They saw the marker, got interested, called me or the office and wanted more information. So people do read them. Number two, this marker will probably be here for a long, long time in all probability. Since 1934, when the markers program first started, most of them are still in place. I think the one at the bottom of the hill is 1937 or whatever. They do last. We do lose a few here and there. Since I've been the chairman since about 2001, we've lost one. It was just gone. I don't know. Sometimes they're used for target practice, but for the most part, they're around for a long time. The other point I want to make is that we are the Illinois State Historical Society. We are not associated with the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency. They are a separate entity. They are a function of the state. They are funded by the state. We are not. We do not receive 1 red cent from any tax money at all. We are all volunteer. That's why we depend on different entities like Rotary clubs, churches, cities, or whatever, or in this case, Lincoln Land Community. I'm sorry. I'm from Springfield. Lewis and Clark. I'm sorry. I apologize for that. But we depend on them to sponsor and put up markers like this. Not only that, President Chapman said about they teach or whatever. I'm supposed to be an Illinois historian. I had never heard of Scott Bibb until this marker deal came up. So they are instructive. People do learn from them. They do read them, and they'll be around for a while. So President Chapman and Lewis and Clark College, the Illinois State Historical Society, thanks you very, very much. Thank you.
No problem, Stu. We call Lincoln Land Lewis and Clark North. No problem.
Good one.
Well, I want to thank all of you for being here today. It's a wonderful crowd, great purpose and great awareness that we're bringing to our area for all the right reasons. So we invite you to stay for some refreshments inside, a tour of the facility, and that proudly displays Scott Bibb's name and his spirit. And thank you for being here.